The bridge of the Vorthian flagship buzzed with the lazy hum of routine operations. Admiral Krikstal leaned back in his command chair, watching the holographic display that showed their patrol sector. Green dots represented friendly vessels, blue indicated trade ships, and the occasional yellow blip marked minor civilian disputes. Nothing red, nothing dangerous, just another boring day in what had become the most peaceful era in galactic history. "Sir, the morning reports," his aide announced, sliding a datapad across the Admiral's armrest. Krikstal barely glanced at it. Cargo disputes, navigation permits, routine maintenance schedules. The kind of paperwork that made him wonder why they even needed a military anymore. Around him, his bridge crew moved with the casual efficiency of people who had never seen real combat. Half the stations were unmanned. Why waste resources on full crews when the biggest threat they faced was pirates with outdated weapons? The younger officers treated their positions like desk jobs, more concerned with their next shore leave than maintaining battle readiness. "Admiral," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving reports from the Outer Rim. Several colonies have gone dark in the past week." Krikstal waved dismissively. "Probably equipment failures. These frontier settlements always have communication problems. File it with maintenance and move on." The officer nodded and returned to his console. Nobody questioned the Admiral's judgment. Why would they? In 30 years, the worst crisis they had faced was a trade embargo that lasted 3 days. Light years away, Captain Lee Hyun gripped the controls of his small spacecraft as it drifted through the void between stars. The Dawn's Edge looked like a relic compared to the sleek vessels that occasionally passed them on shipping lanes. Its hull was scarred and patched, its engines running on jury-rigged components that would make any coalition engineer cringe. But Hyun knew better than to judge by appearances. Behind him, Park Soo hunched over her navigation console, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed star charts stretching across multiple sectors. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion from weeks of constant monitoring. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights spent watching for signs of pursuit. "Hyun," she called softly, not wanting to alarm the rest of their small crew. "I'm still not getting any signals from the Kepler colonies or the mining stations in the Arcturus belt." He felt his stomach clench. The silence from those distant outposts could mean only one thing. "How long since last contact?" "Kepler went quiet 4 days ago. Arcturus yesterday." She paused, checking her readings again. "The pattern matches what we saw at Terra Nova, and New Sol before that." The names of those lost worlds hung in the air between them like ghosts. Hyun remembered the final transmissions from New Sol, the screams that cut through static before everything went silent. He remembered the evacuation of Terra Nova, how they had barely escaped before the sky itself seemed to tear open. Their small crew worked in tense quiet around them. Engineer Kim Min tinkered with weapon systems that were supposed to be deactivated, while Communications Officer Jin Woo monitored frequencies that officially didn't exist. They all knew what the silence meant. They had all seen what happened. When the Devourers arrived, "How far to Coalition space?" Hyun asked. 18 hours at current speed, Park Soo replied. "But Hyun, what if they don't believe us? What if they think we're just another group of refugees with wild stories?" It was a valid concern. The Coalition had enjoyed peace for so long that they had forgotten what real danger looked like. To them, humans were newcomers, a primitive species that had just discovered faster-than-light travel. They would see the Dawn's Edge as a rickety transport full of survivors, not as advanced scouts in a war that had already claimed dozens of worlds. Hyun activated their communication array and began broadcasting the standard first contact protocols. Simple mathematical sequences, basic chemical formulas, peaceful greetings in every language their computers could manage. He made sure their weapons remained powered down and their shields at minimum strength. They needed to look harmless, desperate, and most importantly, primitive. "Remember," he told his crew, "we're refugees, nothing more. They can't know what we really are, not yet." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here they were, survivors of a war that had turned them into something the galaxy had never seen before, pretending to be helpless victims. But it was necessary. The Coalition needed to see the Devourers firsthand before they would understand the true scope of the threat they all faced. As the Dawn's Edge limped toward Coalition space, its crew prepared for the performance of their lives. The Coalition's First Contact Division buzzed with excitement when the Dawn's Edge finally entered their detection range. It had been almost 2 years since they had encountered a new species, and the discovery of another intelligent race always generated scientific enthusiasm throughout their networks. Dr. Velmoth practically bounced on his 6 legs as he reviewed the initial scans of the human vessel. His compound eyes gleamed with curiosity as he studied the primitive design, the patchwork repairs, and the surprisingly crude propulsion system. These creatures had somehow achieved faster-than-light travel, but their technology seemed decades behind Coalition standards. "Fascinating," he muttered to his research team. "Look at these energy readings. They're using some kind of fusion-based system that we abandoned centuries ago, and their hull composition appears to be simple metal alloys rather than our adaptive polymers." The transmission from the human ship crackled through the communication array, filled with static and interference that made Coalition officers wince. Their own communications were crystal clear across entire star systems, but these newcomers seemed to struggle with basic signal clarity. Jin Wu, the human communications officer, spoke slowly and carefully in broken Coalition standard, a language he had clearly learned recently. His accent was thick, his grammar imperfect, making him sound like a child trying to communicate with adults. We come from world called Earth," Jin Wu's voice transmitted across space. "Our home, destroyed. Many dead, we seek safe place, something follows us, very dangerous, please help." The Coalition officers exchanged amused glances. Dr. Velmoth made notes about the primitive communication style, while Admiral Krickstahl rolled his eyes at what he considered typical refugee dramatics. They all claim something terrible is chasing them, the Admiral said to his staff. "Pirates, natural disasters, fictional monsters. It's the same story every time a new species makes contact. They want us to feel sorry for them, so we'll give them better trade agreements." Captain Li Hyun stood on his bridge, listening to the Coalition's polite but condescending responses. They were treating his crew like children who had wandered away from home. The Coalition officers spoke slowly and used simple words, as if humans couldn't understand complex concepts. "We appreciate your situation," came the official response from Admiral Krickstahl. "The Coalition welcomes all peaceful species. We're assigning you to Research Station Omega-7, where our scientists can learn about your culture and provide appropriate assistance." Hyun caught Park Su's eye and saw the same frustration he felt. They were being dismissed, categorized as another primitive race that needed guidance from their more advanced galactic neighbors. The Coalition had no idea they were talking to soldiers who had survived battles that would give their worst nightmares. Research Station Omega-7 orbited, a quiet moon in a system far from major shipping lanes. It was where the Coalition studied new species, a combination of scientific facility and comfortable prison, where newcomers could be observed and catalogued without disrupting galactic commerce. Dr. Velmoth arrived at the station 3 days after. The humans docked, eager to begin his research. He brought teams of xenobiologists, linguists, and social scientists, all excited to study these interesting bipedal creatures. The interviews began immediately. Park Su sat across from a panel of Coalition scientists, trying to explain what had happened to Earth while they nodded politely and took notes. She pulled up star charts on her portable display, showing the locations of destroyed colonies and abandoned systems. "These worlds," she said, pointing to red markers scattered across the galactic map, "all gone, all consumed. The Devourers came from nowhere. They don't communicate. They just take everything." The Coalition scientists studied her data with the patient attention of adults listening to a child's scary story. Dr. Velmoth made gentle notes about human mythology and their apparent tendency toward apocalyptic narratives. "Your data appears corrupted," one scientist explained kindly. "These energy readings don't match any known phenomena. Perhaps your equipment malfunctioned during your journey." Engineer Kim Min tried to demonstrate some of their defensive technologies, but the Coalition researchers assumed the unusual energy signatures were the result of primitive engineering. When he showed them weapon systems that could theoretically punch through Coalition shields, they classified it as crude but interesting and suggested improvements based on their own outdated designs. Jinwoo attempted to share communications intercepts from the destroyed colonies, recordings of final transmissions before worlds went silent. The Coalition linguists listened politely and filed the screams and panic as examples of human emotional expression under stress. Primitive species often develop elaborate mythologies to explain traumatic events, Dr. Velmoth explained to his colleagues. These devourers represent their psychological need to externalize responsibility for their homeworld's destruction, probably a natural disaster they couldn't understand or prevent. The humans found themselves trapped in a comfortable cage of condescension. They were given quarters, food, and access to Coalition databases, but their warnings were treated as folklore. Every attempt to convey the urgency of their situation was met with patient smiles and scientific interest in their fascinating cultural narratives. Captain Lee Hyun stood at the observation deck, staring out at the peaceful star field. Somewhere, out there, the devourers were moving through space, consuming worlds, and converting matter into the energy they needed for their dimensional jumps. Time was running out, and the Coalition had no idea what was coming for them. "How long do we wait?" Park Soo asked quietly, joining him at the window. Hyun checked his chronometer. According to their calculations, the devourers would detect the Coalition's energy signatures within days. "Not much longer," he said grimly. "They'll understand soon enough." The first sign something was wrong came from the outer sensor arrays. Deep space monitoring stations in the Vega sector suddenly stopped, transmitting their regular reports. Not emergency signals, not distress calls, just silence. The kind of absolute quiet that made veteran operators check their equipment twice. Lieutenant Kolvar was manning the night shift at Coalition Command when the anomaly readings started, flooding his console. Energy signatures unlike anything in their databases were appearing at the edge of monitored space. The patterns made no sense, massive spikes followed by complete voids, as if reality itself was being torn apart and stitched back together. "Sir," he called to his supervisor, voice tight with confusion. "I'm getting some really strange readings from Sector 7. The energy levels are off the charts." His supervisor glanced over with the tired expression of someone who had dealt with countless equipment malfunctions. "Probably solar flare interference. File it with maintenance and adjust the filters." But Kolvar couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The readings weren't random, they had a pattern, like breathing, like something alive was moving through space, leaving ripples in reality itself. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Krixtal was reviewing supply reports when his tactical officer suddenly went rigid. The young alien's skin color shifted from its normal blue to a sickly gray as he stared at his displays. "Admiral," the officer whispered, his voice barely audible. "Battle Group 7. They're gone." Krixtal looked up from his paperwork, annoyed at the interruption. "Gone? What do you mean gone? Did they jump to hyperspace early?" "No, sir. They just disappeared. All 12 ships, no distress signals, no weapon discharge, no hyperspace signatures. They were there on sensors, and then they weren't." The Admiral stood slowly, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Battle. Group 7 consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, with crews of nearly 8,000 beings. Ships that size didn't just vanish. "Show me," he commanded, moving to the tactical display. The holographic star map flickered to life, showing the patrol. Routes of various Coalition fleets. Where Battle Group 7 should have been, there was simply empty space. No debris, no energy signatures, no trace that they had ever existed. "Run a full diagnostic on the sensors," Krixtal ordered, his voice steady despite the ice forming in his stomach. "Check for system malfunctions." But even as he gave the order, more reports started flooding in. Battle Group 12 had gone silent. Then the patrol squadrons in the Centauri system. One by one, Coalition forces were simply disappearing from the tactical displays. At Research Station Omega 7, the human crew had been watching their sensors with growing tension. Park Soo hadn't slept in 36 hours, her eyes fixed on the long-range scanners that only she knew how to read properly. "They're here," she announced quietly, her voice cutting through the casual conversation on the Dawn's Edge bridge. Captain. Li Hyun was beside her in seconds, studying the energy patterns that looked like chaos to Coalition eyes, but told a clear story to humans who had learned to recognize the signs. "How many?" he asked. "At least 40 ships in the first wave," Park Soo replied, her fingers dancing over controls that activated systems the Coalition scientists had dismissed as primitive. "They're moving fast, consuming everything in their path." Jin Woo was already at his communication station, but instead of the broken Coalition standard he had been using, he spoke in rapid, flawless English to hidden receivers throughout the sector. "All units, this is Dawn's Edge. The Devourers have arrived. Pattern 7 is in effect. Repeat, Pattern 7 is in effect." Engineer Kim Min moved to what the Coalition researchers thought was a simple power distribution panel. His hands found hidden switches and controls that had been dormant for weeks. The ship's energy signature began to change, revealing technology that operated on principles the galaxy's most advanced scientists couldn't begin to understand. "Activating combat systems," he reported calmly. "All weapons coming online." The Dawn's Edge began to transform. Hull plating shifted and reconfigured, revealing weapon ports that had been seamlessly hidden. The ship's primitive fusion reactor was suddenly putting out energy levels that should have been impossible with their technology. Dr. Velmoth was in his laboratory when the station's alarms began wailing. He rushed to the observation deck, expecting to see some kind of accident or mechanical failure. Instead, he saw something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Space itself was tearing open like a wound. Not the clean geometric portals of hyperspace travel, but ragged rips in reality that seemed to bleed darkness. Through these tears came ships that defied every law of physics and engineering he knew. The vessels were massive, easily dwarfing Coalition dreadnoughts, but their design made no sense. They seemed to be part machine, part organism, their hulls writhing with what looked like muscle tissue and nerve endings. Sections of their surfaces pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. As he watched in horror, one of the nightmare ships simply touched a Coalition patrol vessel. The moment of contact lasted less than a second, but the patrol ship simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not vaporized, it was there one moment and gone the next, as if it had never existed at all. "Dear Cosmos," Dr. Velmoth whispered, finally, understanding why the humans had looked so haunted when they tried to explain what had destroyed their world. Back on the Dawn's Edge, Captain Li Hyun stood at his command position, watching Coalition forces vanish from the tactical display. He felt no satisfaction in being right, only the grim determination of someone who had been fighting this war for far longer than anyone should have to fight. "Signal the station," he ordered Jin Woo. "Tell them they're primitive refugees are about to save their lives. The real battle was about to begin." The emergency klaxons screamed through Research Station Omega-7 as another Coalition fleet vanished from the tactical displays. Dr. Velmoth stumbled through the corridors, his multiple limbs shaking as he tried to process what he had witnessed. The impossible ships, the way matter simply ceased to exist when touched by those writhing hulls. Everything the humans had tried to warn them about was happening exactly as they had predicted. He burst into the docking bay where the Dawn's Edge was berthed, expecting to find the human crew cowering in terror like any rational beings would when faced with such cosmic horror. Instead, he found them working with calm, methodical precision that chilled him to his core. Park Soo sat at her navigation console, but something was wrong with her. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only whites, and thin lines of what looked like circuitry were glowing beneath her skin. Her hands moved across controls that definitely hadn't been there before, manipulating interfaces that seemed to respond to her thoughts rather than her touch. "What are you doing to her?" Dr. Velmoth demanded, rushing toward the human woman. Captain Li Hyun caught his arm with surprising strength. "She's interfacing with their technology," he said calmly, reading their attack patterns, predicting their next moves. "That's impossible," the scientist protested. "No organic being can directly interface with technology like that. The neural feedback would kill anyone who tried." Hyun's smile was cold and humorless. "It killed most of us. Park Soo is third generation. Her grandmother was one of the first humans to survive neural contact with devourer systems. Her brain has adapted pathways that don't exist in other species. As if responding to her mental commands, the Dawn's Edge began another transformation. What Dr. Velmoth had assumed were decorative hull panels slid away to reveal sensor arrays that hurt to look at directly. The ship's primitive-looking engines suddenly blazed with energy signatures that registered off the scale of Coalition. Measuring devices. You lied to us. Admiral Krikstal's voice crackled over the communication system as his command ship limped toward the research station. Your vessel, your technology, everything about your capabilities. Jin Wu looked up from his console and Dr. Velmoth gasped at what he saw. The human's eyes reflected light like a predator's, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies that shouldn't exist. We told you exactly what we were, Jin Wu replied. Survivors of a war with the Devourers. You chose to hear refugees instead of veterans. Engineer Kim Min activated another hidden system, and the ship's hull began to shift like living tissue. Armor plates rearranged themselves into configurations that followed no engineering principles in Coalition databases. Weapon ports opened that seemed to fold space around themselves. How is this possible? Dr. Velmoth whispered, his scientific mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Evolution, Captain Li Hyun said simply. When the Devourers first attacked Earth, 90% of our population died in the first wave. The survivors had to adapt or join them. Our children grew up breathing air contaminated with dimensional energy. So our grandchildren learned to see patterns in chaos that would drive your species insane. Through the observation windows, they could see Coalition ships engaging the Devourer vessels. The alien warships fired their most powerful weapons, energy, beams that could crack planets. The beams struck the writhing hulls of the nightmare ships and simply vanished, absorbed without trace. Your weapons can't hurt them, Park Su said, her voice strangely distorted as she maintained her neural link. They exist partially outside normal space-time. You're firing at shadows. Pilot Choi Jun took control of the Dawn's Edge, and Dr. Velmoth felt his stomach lurch as the ship began moving in ways that violated everything he knew about physics. They accelerated and turned simultaneously, following flight paths that should have torn the vessel apart from gravitational stress. Watch, Choi Jun said, his hands moving across controls that seemed to anticipate his intentions. This is how you fight something that doesn't follow your rules. The human ship dove toward a massive Devourer vessel, approaching at an angle. That made no tactical sense. Coalition doctrine would have called it suicide, flying directly into the path of an enemy that could erase matter with a touch. But as they closed distance, something impossible happened. The Dawn's Edge seemed to phase in and out of reality, becoming translucent for split seconds before solidifying again. When the Devourer's hull tentacles reached out to consume them, they passed through empty space. Dimensional shifting, Kim Min explained to the stunned alien scientists. We learned it by studying captured Devourer technology. Most species can't survive the process. The dimensional energy rewrites your neural pathways, drives you insane, but humans who've been exposed for generations can handle it. They watched. As the Dawn's Edge fired weapons that definitely hadn't existed moments before. Instead of energy beams or projectiles, the ship seemed to shoot controlled tears in space-time itself. Where these tears struck the Devourer vessel, sections of its hull simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, but removed from reality entirely. The nightmare ship writhed and twisted, its bioluminescent patterns flashing in what might have been pain or rage. For the first time since the attack began, a Devourer vessel was actually being damaged. We studied them for 3 generations, Captain Li Hyun said, watching the alien ship's death throes with the detached interest of a scientist observing lab results. Captured their technology, dissected their biology, learned to think like them. It was the only way to survive. Jin Wu's communication console lit up with incoming transmissions from across Coalition space, but these weren't distress calls from dying colonies. They were coordination signals between multiple human vessels, all speaking in rapid coded language that the Coalition's translation systems couldn't decipher. How many of you are there? Admiral Krikstal demanded over the comlink. Enough, Li Hyun replied simply. We've been infiltrating Coalition space for months, preparing for this moment. Every refugee ship, every lost colony vessel that requested asylum, we've been positioning assets throughout your territory. Dr. Velmuth felt the bottom drop out of his world. You used us, made us think you were helpless primitives while you prepared for war. We prepared to save your lives, Park Su corrected, her glowing eyes fixed on displays showing devourer movements throughout the sector. Though after fighting these things for generations, we sometimes forget the difference between salvation and conquest. The transformation was complete. The humble refugees who had begged for sanctuary were gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Soldiers who had spent their entire species' recent history learning to become the perfect weapons against cosmic nightmares. And now the Coalition was about to learn what it truly meant to be saved by monsters. Across Coalition space, reality shimmered as hundreds of human vessels dropped their cloaking fields simultaneously. Ships that had been hiding in asteroid belts, behind moons, and in the empty spaces between star systems suddenly appeared on every sensor grid in the galaxy. Admiral Crixtall stared at his tactical display in disbelief as red dots representing human vessels filled his screen. They weren't scattered randomly like refugees seeking shelter. They were positioned with military precision at every major trade route, every Coalition military base, every population center. "This is impossible," he whispered. "We monitored every ship that entered our space. We catalogued every refugee vessel." Captain Li Hyun's voice came through the communication channel with a tone that had shed all pretense of humility. "You catalogued what we wanted you to see. Every broken-down transport, every damaged colony ship, every primitive vessel that limped into your ports begging for help. They were all part of Operation Silent Dawn." On his own bridge, Fleet Commander Bei Su-jin stood before a massive, holographic display showing the entire galactic sector. Her uniform was pristine black, unmarked by any insignia the Coalition would recognize. Her face carried the kind of cold calculation that came from fighting a war where surrender meant the extinction of your entire species. "All units, this is command," she spoke into her headset. "Operation Silent Dawn is now active. Begin extermination." Protocol, the response was immediate and terrifying. Human ships throughout Coalition space began transforming, shedding their disguises like snakes shedding skin. Crude-looking hulls reconfigured into sleek weapons platforms. Ancient-looking engines blazed with energy that made Coalition power. Cores looked like candles. Dr. Velmuth watched from Research Station Omega-7 as the Dawn's Edge completed its own transformation. The ship that had housed primitive refugees was now a machine of war that operated on principles his species couldn't begin to understand. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long have you been planning this?" Jin Woo looked up from his console, his eyes still carrying that inhuman glow. "Since the day Earth fell. Every human who escaped, every colony ship that fled the Devourers. We've all been working toward this moment for 3 generations. The battle that followed wasn't really a battle at all. It was an extermination. Human vessels moved through space with predatory grace, hunting down devourer ships with tactics that seemed to anticipate every move their enemies would make. Where Coalition forces had been helpless against the nightmare vessels, human weapons carved through their defenses like they were made of paper. Pilot Choi Jun demonstrated maneuvers that made seasoned Coalition officers sick just watching. His ship folded space around itself, existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, striking at devourer vessels from angles that shouldn't exist. "Watch how they hunt," Captain Li Hyun said to the horrified alien observers. "Devourers feed on dimensional energy. They expect their prey to flee, to panic, to make mistakes, but we don't run anymore." A massive devourer ship, easily the size of a Coalition space station, found itself surrounded by a dozen human vessels. The nightmare creature's hull writhed and pulsed, reaching out with tentacles of living metal to consume its attackers. But the human ships didn't try to escape. Instead, they coordinated their attack with surgical precision. Each vessel fired at specific points on the Devourer's hull, targeting organs and neural clusters that Coalition scientists hadn't even known existed. "We spent decades dissecting their dead," Engineer Kim Min explained, as they watched the massive creature convulse in what could only be described as agony. Every piece of technology we captured, every biological sample we recovered, we studied. It all. We know exactly where to hurt them. The Devourer's death wasn't silent like the Coalition ships had been. It screamed across multiple dimensions, a sound that registered on sensors as reality itself groaning under the strain. But the humans showed no emotion as they systematically destroyed what had once been an unstoppable force. Admiral Krikstal realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just a military victory, but the methodical genocide of a species that had terrorized entire galaxies. "Is this necessary?" he asked over the communication channel. "They're already defeated. Why continue?" Commander Bei Su-jin's response was delivered with the cold efficiency of someone who had calculated the cost of mercy and found it too high. "Because if we leave even one of them alive, they'll adapt. They'll learn from this defeat and return stronger. We made that mistake once before." Park Su's neural interface showed her the bigger picture. Devourer vessels throughout the galaxy were falling to coordinated human attacks. Ships that had seemed invincible were being systematically eliminated by soldiers who had spent their entire lives learning to become the perfect predator. "This is what Earth became," she said, her voice distorted by the dimensional energy flowing through her modified neural pathways. "Not a world of peace and exploration like other species. We became a breeding ground for the galaxy's most efficient killers." The final Devourer ship in their sector died with a sound like reality tearing. Its massive hull imploded into dimensions that human science could navigate, but Coalition physics couldn't even detect. As the battle ended, an eerie quiet settled over Coalition space. The nightmare was over, but Admiral Krikstal found himself wondering if they had simply traded one horror for another. "What happens now?" he asked. Captain Lee Hyun looked out at the stars where Coalition worlds still spun peacefully, their populations, unaware of how close they had come to extinction. "Now you live, your children grow up, your species continues. That's what we fought for." "And humanity?" There was a long pause before Lee Hyun answered. "We do what we've always done. We watch the darkness between stars and make sure nothing like the Devourers ever threatens the galaxy again." The Coalition had survived, but they would never forget the price of their salvation. They owed their existence to a species that had transformed itself into something beyond recognition, abandoning everything that made life worth living to ensure others could keep living it. In the end, Earth's children had become the guardians of the galaxy, whether the galaxy wanted them or not.